In this experiment, they're looking at how a certain antidepressant affects participants that are dealing with depression. And what was measured after a 4-week period is pretty much how depressed they felt based on a certain depression test. Here's the placebo group, the recorded numbers, the low dose of the antidepressant, and a moderate dose of the antidepressant. And this is the numbers that we have gathered. Now, the total of those numbers are right here in these columns. So that's the total of placebo, the total of the low dose, and the total of the moderate. And I have the totals for this 369, which is all these numbers added up. And I also calculated the means of each group. And in this side table in between, I squared the individual numbers. So X, I squared those and I added them up because we'll be using that later in solving for our sum of squares. Now with the null hypothesis, we're going to assume that there is no difference. So we have it so that the placebo, mu placebo equals the mu of the low dose equals the mu of the moderate dose. So this is going to be our null hypothesis. Now, since we're doing an ANOVA, we need to find two different types of degrees of freedom. We have to find the between and the within. And here's the formula for that. K being how many groups we're dealing with. We're dealing with 3 groups minus 1. So for the between, degrees of freedom between is 2. For the within, it's the total number of all the participants, which is 15, minus the total different groups. There's 3 groups. So with that degrees of freedom, we get 12. Now we go look at our F table using the between degrees of freedom as our X value if we're looking at a table, and then 12 as with the degrees of freedom within as our Y value. So in the chart, when we look it up, we get 3.88 is our critical region. Now, first I did the sum of squares within, so here's the formula for that. And you have to do it for each individual group. So you have to do it for the placebo, the low dose, and the moderate dose. So for the placebo, I had already squared all these and added it up. So I plugged that in. Oh wait, right here. Plugged it in, and then the total number of the original numbers added up, squared over how many participants were in that group. So the total squared values minus the total numbers squared over how many people, 5. So plugged in those numbers, solved through, and I got 285.2 as my sum of squares for the placebo group. Did the same for the low dose. Oh, I forgot to fill that in. But what that is, that number right there, it's supposed to be this 103 squared. I had messed up, but just imagine it's 103 squared over 5. And that's the total amount squared once I squared right here. So follow through, do the math, get 277.2 as our sum of squares low dose. Did the same thing for the moderate. Solve through, and you get 246.8 as the sum of squares. You add all these up to get the within sum of squares, so all your sum of squares you did for each group, you get 809.2, and then you also got to do the mean square for within, which is the sum of squares within divided by the degrees of freedom within. We got 809.2 for our sum of squares within total over the degrees of freedom 12, which within, it's right here, divide out, you get 67.43 as our mean square. Now, to continue our math, we're doing the sum of squares between. So that is the formula at the top for the sum of squares between. It's our total number squared, which is the total number is pretty much what we measured. We are adding all those up and squaring them, divided by how many are in that group. So there's going to be 5 in each group, minus the total overall in the study's results squared over the total number of people in the study. So I got these numbers from our, it's all the scores added up, 192 squared over there's 5 participants. In the second group, there's 103 total scores squared over 5 participants in that group. And then in the third group, there was 74 total numbers or scores squared and over the 5 people in that group. So you add those up minus the total number of all the scores squared over the total number of all the participants. So we do that math, square them, and then divide out, add, minus. You get 1,512.4 as our sum of squares between. Now we have to do our, I forgot what it's called, the mean square? Yeah, the mean squares for the between. So sum of squares between over degrees of freedom between. Degrees of freedom between was 2. This is our sum of squares between. Divide out, got 756.2 as our mean squares for between. To get our f value, we do the mean squares between over the mean squares within. Put in those numbers, and you get 11.215 as our f value. Now, this is our critical that we are dealing with, and we're not in the body, we're actually in the tail end. So, what that means is that we reject the null hypothesis. There is a significant difference in the levels of depression with the different treatments. And then we have our statistic out right here. F are 2 different degrees of freedom, what our F value is, and P is less than 0.05. The end.